Vampire Coast is one of the most prolific, as well as one of the most famous portions of Lustria. Many of you guys know it as the region of the world that is probably known best for its pirates, its zombie pirates. And in today's video, we're going to talk about Luthor Harkon. We're going to talk about the Vampire Coast. We're going to talk about what a Vampire Coast army or campaign would look like in Total War Warhammer 2. As we kind of come up to a supposed release of the next campaign pack, I want to talk about some of those possible races that would fit really nicely into a campaign pack for the Total War Warhammer 2 Vortex campaign. We saw with the Tomb Kings that this was an entirely different campaign for them. Even though they were on the Vortex map and part of that campaign, they weren't vying for power of the Great Vortex. So maybe Luthor Harkon and his Vampire Coast army, his small nation, has a very different set of rules or a very different set of objectives than the rest of the armies in the Vortex campaign. So join me in today and let's talk a little bit about the Vampire Coast, its army list, as well as some of the mechanics of I think at least, might be in the Total War Warhammer 2 interpretation of the Vampire Coast. So you really can't talk about the Vampire Coast without talking about Luthor Harkon himself. And he has a pretty long and sordid history. We've talked about Luthor in the past, but it's worth bringing up again and rediscussing for the purpose of this video because it does pertain to him. But Luthor Harkon comes from Lamia. He's actually one of the vampires that was converted by Abhorash, the primogenitor of the vampire Blood Knight's bloodline, or I'm sorry, the Blood Dragon vampire bloodline. And he became one of his chief assistants or champions. He was the harbor guard of Lamia. And after the fall of Lamia, he followed Abhorash into Morkane. And Morkane, we know, is pretty much like Lamia 2.0. Morkane is this kind of resurgent empire of all of the ancient vampire bloodlines that kind of come together under the Strigoi Ghoul King. And once Morkane falls apart, everyone really kind of goes their own way. That's the kind of ending point of all the vampires being a cohesive unit. Well, I guess as cohesive as vampires can be. And when this happens, Luthor ends up on a boat. Somewhere close to Lustria. And this boat gets attacked, gets raided by Norskins. And the Norskins find in this boat a lovely, beautiful casket. And why would that not be terrifying to you as a superstitious Norskin? And in that casket, in that coffin, is Luthor Harkon. Luthor Harkon breaks out of the casket in the middle of the night and converts the entire crew to zombie pirates, to Norskin pirates, basically. Zombie, Norskin, pirate, dead, Norskin, zombie pirates. And this is the very beginning of the Vampire Coast, because they wash up on the shores of northeastern Lustria, right by Huadl and the rest of the temples around there, the soon-to-be City of the Dead, which is to the south of that in the Volcanic Islands. And Luthor Harkon starts this mini empire. He kind of making lemon juice out of lemons, or whatever the fuck the saying is. He kind of looks at this and goes, you know what, I can do something with this. And he slowly starts to convert the populace around him of any of the wayward travelers. He takes these ships and he goes and corsairs up and down the coast, marauding for other ships to convert, to turn to his zombie pirate, into his new Vampire Coast nation. And by doing this, he raises sea monsters from the depths. He raises all these ships from the depths, and it talks about this giant undead fleet led by Luthor Harkon. And it's a really kind of a cool imagery, and one that I think is kind of really glossed over in the history of Warhammer as well as Total War. I mean, we don't really go into much about this, and even in 7th, 6th, 8th editions, I mean, all this information comes from a White Dwarf. I think it was like episode. I think it was like article number 315 or 16, and it talks about that's back in 6th edition, I believe, too. And it talks about the Vampire Coast army list. And then the 7th edition has a Warhammer Chronicles update, which has his army list semi-updated for 7th edition. 8th edition never really got its full facelift for him. So the Vampire Coast in and of itself has really been glossed over, even though it's a really cool set of imagery and a very different one, This is basically Warhammer's answer to adding pirates to the game. So Luthor Harkon, though, we mentioned Huadl earlier, this ancient Slan temple. Luthor Harkon, in the typical vampire fashion, goes to plunder this temple. It goes to kind of further his knowledge of the divine, or of the arcane. And in the temple are many wards that kind of drain the magic of it and dispel the magic of chaos and, well, subsequently undeath, forms of magic and corruption. So when he comes into this, he's having all of his little ghoul goblin things go into, zombies, doing the digging for him. And this is, every single time he does this, the glyphs drain them of their magical essence and just kind of leave these lifeless husks. So Luthor just gets pissed outright and goes and attacks the seals with like all of his magic might, which is not considerable to begin with. Remember, he is still of the Blood Dragon bloodline, and they do not have remarkable magical abilities. In fact, they eschew it entirely. They do not like magic. It is considered unmartial and dishonorable. So by doing this, the wards actually backfire and completely cripple Luthor's brain. And that is a big kind of point of his character. He's just kind of this mentally disturbed, schizophrenic vampire lord that is prone to bouts of anger or bouts of just complete stupidity. So it's very interesting to have what is otherwise a very terrifying lord and a vampire be a kind of a very random wild card, almost like the mechanics that you get from tabletop Skaven, and that, yeah, Skaven could be really great 1 second or just completely implode on themselves, which is in a lot of ways really cool. So Luthor Harkon has a lot of abilities here, and he has a lot of special rules, but he doesn't really have a lot of magic items, so he's going to be an interesting choice if they were to choose him as a legendary lord. As far as the placement map on the map goes, though, for the Vampire Coast, I mean, they're in a pretty good, modest area. You know, they've got some lizardmen to their west, they've got Skaven to the south, and I think that's going to be their kind of their native conflict, I guess you could say. And then Tomb Kings across the way, followed by Norskins further north, and more lizardmen, and of course the dark and high elves, the more northern you get. So let's kind of look at what those mechanics might look like, though, if Luthor Harkon, or I'm sorry, if the Vampire Coast was an actual faction. What would their objective be like? Well, maybe the big objective for Luthor is to plunder as much magic as he can. And we know that Total War is familiar with kind of playing with the timeline, right? Maybe this happens before Luthor Harkon goes completely mad, where he's got to split personalities. So maybe his main objective, his primary objective, is to take all of the major Slann temples that are important to the geomantic web. Maybe that's the big objective for him, and he has to hit out all of these and basically take over southern Lustria with like maybe each one of those gives him specific rules, or I'm sorry, gives him specific benefits to his army, in the same way that we get with the Tomb Kings, right? Each one of the Books of the Dead or the Books of the Nagash that you grab gives you better recruitment capabilities or upkeep capabilities, or gives you access to another lord outright, because that's a big thing for the Tomb Kings. So that'd be a very interesting thing. And Luthor Harkon, though, is really, as part of the army list rules for the Vampire Coast, it says you have to have Luthor Harkon in your army. So that proposes an interesting challenge. Maybe he can't have multiple armies, and he has to rely on ramshackle crap armies and deal with a lot of special rules at the top end, right? At his hero level, at his lord level, at his maybe campaign mechanics. Maybe he has these remarkable ships of Vampire Coast army. It's an actual roster. Maybe that kind of acts as a Dark Elf Black Ark, you know, something of that sort, that it does kind of really focuses the Vampire Coast on marauding more so than just staying as a land-bound army moving conventionally through every single faction they can. So I'd really be excited to see how they incorporate Vampire Coast into Total War Warhammer 2, because there are so many different ways you could do it, because they've played with a lot of different stuff, with a lot of different factions now. But Vampire Coast is not cut and dry. It's not a very easy army to kind of just go, oh yeah, it's just kind of a reskinned version of Vampire Counts. And in a lot of ways it is kind of like that, but there are a lot of things that do make it different. So I'm going to ask for some help for this video. And this video I'm going to be using a mod, actually. And you guys know I'm not really huge on mods, but Demonic Spotter made a mod for the Vampire Coast. There is very little artwork and model design for these guys, and I really like to showcase the tabletop versions of everything, but for this video, since there's very little of everything for Vampire Coast would be a super custom army for Creative Assembly. I'm going to use this mod to kind of exemplify as many of the models as we can. So we'll start off talking about, we're going more into Luthor Harkon's special rules and their representation on Total War, Warhammer 2, as well as the rest of the units in the game. But we'll start off with Luthor Harkon's actual model in the game. So again, guys, not a lot of media to go off of here as far as tabletop actual art. So here is our representation of Luthor Harkon. Very, very cool one. Very good one at that. So Luthor Harkon only has 2 special rules. He's got Magical Void, because, he attacked Waddle, those glyphs. They drained him of all of his magic, kind of severed his tie to magic. If you're familiar with Knights of the Old Republic 2, think of how your main character gets severed from the Force, right? So with Magical Void, you don't get access to your typical vampire spells. Instead, you get magic resistance 3. So he has a higher innate magic resistance, meaning he can really kind of knock out your Bit of Bunas or any kind of a typical spell or soul leech that you want to cast on, say, Luthor Harkon or anything of the sort. So I think that's a kind of a cool, interesting trade-off here. You have this vampire lord that isn't so much of a caster that can harass backline, but he is maybe this lord that's meant mainly for combat, and his profile would definitely, just like any other vampire's profile, would definitely lend to that. A very high weapon skill, which is, I guess, melee attack. You can get that too. The Magical Void special ability plays heavily into his split personality special ability, or special rule. And this basically means that on the beginning of every turn in tabletop, you roll a dice. And if that die corresponds to a certain number on a chart, you have to have a certain effect kick in. Like for Brainlock, you actually, his personalities fight amongst themselves, and you have to roll a die to pass a leadership, or you're stupid. You get the stupidity special rule. There's one called Mad, in which case he gets Frenzy. So there's a bunch of different ways we could do this. Now, the mod just gave him a static buff, and I kind of like the way the mod did this. Or, I'm sorry, a static ability. In that, let's take a look here. You can see the whole army roster right there. Let's see, where is it here? It's right there. So, Revitalizing Madness. So, as soon as his hit points drop below 20%, I'm sorry, as long as his hit points are above 20%, I'm sorry, no, they drop below 20%. Sometimes the fucking syntax these confuses the crap out of me. He gets a huge burst to his HP replenishment, gets a boost to his melee attack into his leadership, but his melee defense drops and his accuracy drops. So I kind of like that. I kind of like that he gets this nice ability to stay in the fight, gets to really do a little bit more damage. At the same time, he is way less reliable, and he is, as far as like his shots go, because you can see mod gave him a 400 AP because he's got this little pistol here, which is a pretty cool way of doing things, I think. In the actual tabletop, he has a hand weapon and a brace of pistols, and he has to be used exactly that way. He can't be used any other way. So I kind of enjoy that use of Revitalizing Madness and how that works, because it does talk about how the lower in his wounds he gets, the more unstable his mind becomes. This kind of represents that in a pretty cool, very flavorful fashion. I like the way the mod did that with Luthor Harkon here. You can't talk about Harkin, though, without talking about his vampire fleet captains. Yes, again, same Witch Hunter model base here, but I think it's kind of cool. The fleet captains are pretty huge to the lore. Harkin has a captain, Captain Dracula, that actually saves him during the end times. I didn't really go into this with Harkin, but the end times were pretty crazy. He becomes the Mortarch of the Abyss and leads his grand army against the army of Xandri, the grand navy of Xandri and Khemri. So basically, when Nagash is trying to subjugate all of the Tomb Kings and Khemri and everything, he uses Luthor Harkon's navy and naval prowess to really kind of break the back of Xandri. And Xandri is, to that date, like probably one of the strongest navies in the Warhammer world. And he wins that fight and helps take over the rest of Khemri. Later in the lore, Isabella von Karstein becomes corrupted by Nurgle and helps pretty much arrest Sylvania from the rest of the vampires. And Harkin and Manfred and Vlad von Karstein end up in this one tavern, kind of like, okay, well, how are we going to do this? Okay, well, we'll do this, and this. And this next grand battle appears, basically, and the battle does not go well. I mean, as soon as Nurgle infests the undead, he pretty much becomes anathema to the undead. And as a result, Luthor Harkon goes to flee the battlefield on his little Mortarch dragon, Naga something like that. And these basically these giant undead dragon beast things are really weird, but they're kind of cool in a weird steampunky way. And Manfred von Karstein, being the consummate dick that he is, cuts his hand off, and Luthor Harkon falls into basically a sea of demons and undead, and eventually gets overcome. That's how our mighty Luthor falls. But the vampire fleet captain, though, and Captain Drekla, basically saves him in many occasions throughout the entirety of his life. The vampire fleet captain, though, is basically a white. There's nothing different here. They're, for the most part, they're the same kind of rules. That killing blow, that heroic killing blow type stuff. The Harkin's captains, or shipwhites, are all carefully animated from the mariners that he captures. Given the Arch Grand Commodore's whimsical nature, these tend to be bloodthirsty souls whose grasp on rational thought is a little less than solid. And they have a really cool special rule called White Blades. It means any hand weapon carried by the fleet captains is magic. So that's kind of cool, right? And the mod does a good credence to that. And that's how we would expect them in Total War Warhammer 2, is their hand pistol would be magic. Their actual weapon, their actual saber that he's got, would be magic. In the tabletop, you can swap that pistol out for an additional hand weapon, so he's got two. So maybe that's the kind of thing that you can do here. A fleet captain can be multiple flavors, right? You can have him use 2 sabers, 2 swords, so he's anti-infantry, and he's got killing blow, so he's got AP attached to it as well. And he's got magic damage, or magic attacks from his sword and his, well, he wouldn't have a pistol if he had 2 weapons. Or, again, you can have him like this, in which case he's got 1 pistol and 1 post-combat weapon, so both of which do magic. And I really kind of like that approach here. And we'll take a look what the mod shows for him. Dump that back in. So the mod, again, shows him magic attacks for his melee attack and for his ammunition, and it gives him AP as well. He does have Deadly Onslaught and Heroic Killing Blow in this mod, and that's just strictly the mod. The difference, though, you're probably wondering, okay, what's the difference between him and a white? Well, the mod made his armor a little bit lower, and I agree. He has light armor in Total War, in Tabletop. A white in Tabletop in the Vampire Count's army has heavy armor, so it would make sense that he would have a lower armor value. He does have a little bit higher of melee attack, and he has obviously a missile that does AP damage, and also his melee attacks are magic. The white, the standard edition Vampire Count's white does not have magic attacks. So all in all, I think a very fun and a very good flavorful addition to the way that these guys are done. But I think that they would have to be a little bit more. And this kind of comes back on my whole thing of battle standard bearers needing to be in the game and having them be pretty pivotal, because you can have your fleet captain be your battle center bearer, in which he's throwing up the actual colors of the Vampire Coast army, kind of help have some lasting effects throughout the entirety. And I think that that's important here, is that we get those battle center bearers somehow in the game. Heroic heroes, I guess you could say. Let's jump over to another hero, and another one that we're all familiar with, which is essentially the Banshee the Cyrene, with an interesting choice of model here, but it plays. She should be a little bit more ethereal, because she is ethereal. Here's a little lore blurb from it. Tales speak of the Cyrenes that lure mariners to their doom on the rocks along the Vampire Coast. These wretched creatures are much akin to the banshees of the old world, and are to be feared on dry land as they are on the seas. Not really a lot of crazy stuff with these in the lore. The tabletop just basically has them having a scream attack, and that's really it. So basically the exact same thing as a Banshee. Nothing overly to write home about, but they are ethereal, so they can do a lot of harassment and get a lot done. They do kind of play that somewhat of an assassin role in the army, because it is hard to kill them. It is not the easiest thing in the world with that ethereal. You do that magic weapon to do some more damage. Let's kind of take a look at how the mod does these guys justice, and I actually really enjoy what the mod does for these. Let's take a look here. So it gives them AP attacks, which is cool, and magic attacks, which is great, but it gives them an ability called Siren's Call. So this just decreases melee defense. In the actual book, it's an attack, very similar to what we see with the Terrorgeists. So I like this ability to kind of lure things, or the Siren's Song bewitches the foe. They are stunned by sheer beauty, and it lowers their melee defense. I like that a lot. And on top of it, they have Alluring Presence, which is a hex in an area that gives leadership to the undead, but also drops the accuracy and melee attack and melee defense of things around them. I really like how they did things here, because it makes the Cyrene a little bit more of a support. I mean, they even use this little symbol here Masters of Illusion and mind manipulation. They are most renowned for their singing, which can completely bewitch a man. I like that kind of approach to these being that kind of a little bit more of almost like an undead bard, right? I kind of dig that a lot more than just this, hey, here's this annoying banshee creature just going to scream and fly at you the whole damn time. I like that a lot. So I think that kind of a different role for the Cyrene will help make this different. This is going to be the biggest fight, is help make this different than Vampire Coast, or if our counts. This can't just simply be a rebranded Vampire Count army, because all of us will riot, and on top of it, it'll be boring as fuck. So we have to kind of take this with a grain of salt, obviously, but also how can we really approach these characters in different and new lights? Especially considering that, I mean, this is the next unit here, obviously. Zombie Pirate Deckhands mob. And they're just zombies for the most part. But how are we going to make these a little bit different? That's the, the crux of it all, right? That's the rub. Bet you guys didn't think you'd be seeing undead nipples today, but here they are, lo and behold. So these guys are a little bit different, and I like, again, what the mod has done with them. They use these kind of different models for them and everything, but I expect a zombie horde with pirate hats and not empire hats and all sorts of cool, fun stuff on it. I mean, the units in the game are a little bit larger than normal zombie units that we see in the tabletop, so they have a higher unit count. But for the most part, they are the same thing, but they have a slightly higher weapon skill. They have a weapon skill of 3 versus the weapon skill of 2 of normal zombies. They've got that going for them as well. So they are a little bit more stalwart. They have a higher strength and toughness than your normal zombie. So I kind of like that. These guys being a little bit more like Empire foot soldiers than like zombies, but still obvious at the same time being zombies. So they're undead. They don't suffer the normal kind of leadership penalties that a state troop of the Empire would. I'm sorry, the lack of leadership of the Empire would. But something that the mod did too here is they have a higher armor. Now that's not indicative in the tabletop. There's nothing in the tabletop that these guys have no armor. I guess I see what they were saying is that these guys are supposed to be a little bit more elite, and that fits the lore here. So let's read this. Festooned with all manner of rusty and corroded weaponry, zombie pirates make up the bulk of Harkin's damned followers. Unlike most reanimated vessels, some vicious spark of personality resides deep within their rotten souls, making them all the more formidable in combat. So these guys do remember a little bit of their combat prowess from their previous life. Maybe they do hold on to a little bit of the possessions of the previous life, so they have a little bit more armor. But I like this kind of ramshackle looking horde and mob because it makes zombies a little more scary, right? I mean, you could throw a unit of state troops against these guys and they'd probably have a run for their money. And I think that's going to have to be what the deal is with the Vampire Coast. Their army has to have a pretty shitty zombie horde, because the entirety of the Vampire Coast army is zombies, but it has to be just a little bit different so that it isn't just really low quality troops. That you still get good, somewhat decent troops out of these things, because you don't have a grave guard to fall back on as your strong center line. You've got to have something like this that is at least passable, that at least can just get you through the gate, keep it so that you get your special units in there to do more damage. Speaking of special units, so let's just jump on over to the Pirate Gunnery Mob. And there's 2 real flavors for these guys. You can have them with just, there we go, handguns and swords, so you're kind of like your Free Company militia, or you can have them with just like handguns, just like your handguns, your gunners for Empire. So you have a little bit of an option here as far as how do you want these guys to play. Do you want them to be more dedicated range, or do you want them to be that hybrid Free Company militia? So I'll stay at the overlapped portion of this unit so you can see both. So let's get into the lore blurb on these guys. Though their weapons are rusted and sodden, many of Harkin's undead pirates cling to the guns they held so dear in life. Wielding a shabby collection of black powder weapons long past their best, the zombies of the gunnery mob still gain a small spark of the satisfaction they enjoyed in life through the random discharge of noisy, indiscriminate firepower. So this is a big thing for the Vampire Coast, and what helps separate them from vampire counts is they have access to black powder weaponry. They have access to guns. And I should have talked about this more in the previous 2 entries, but I think it's important to talk about it now in this one, because in tabletop, zombies have 0 ballistic skill, meaning they have 0 chance to hit things. In any other army, that means that they cannot use ranged weapons. In the Vampire Coast army, It means that anytime that they roll dice to roll a die to see if they hit a unit, they roll. If they roll a 6, they hit. If they roll a 1, basically it backfires and kills the zombie. So it's kind of a really cool, fun, wonky, wacky mechanic. Again, same thing. And I'd love to see a firing line like that. That it's like, okay, it's a perch on the hill. Oh god, they got us. They got their sights on us. The whole line down the whole gun line opens fire, and some of them just fall over dead because it backfires on. The other ones just kind of haphazardly bounce off the ground, and some of your soldiers die. But if you can take so many of these, and there's such a high unit count, they're so cheap, then imagine the amount of firepower that you can bring to the fore, because you have, you know, let's say you've got a total of, I'm just going to use a blanket number, 1,000 zombies firing, and if, you know, 10% of those were to hit, that's still 100 bullets coming into you. So I think it's a really fun, kind of crazy, cool, wonky mechanic that I think that the Skaven should have had a little bit more of, but hopefully with Vampire Coast, we'll get something that does true to that wonky nature. So you can have them, again, have either their hand weapon, or as I zoom out there, their hand weapon and a pistol, or their full-on rifle. You can actually even place a handgun with just a brace of pistols, which is kind of cool too. So maybe there's some variations to these guys, and that kind of becomes a different flavor and style of playing them as well. One of the other things, though, I want to talk about with the Vampire Count's army is they have a special rule aquatic. So swamplands and stuff like that does not bog them down in the same way it doesn't bog down crocscores or skinks. So I'd love to see this. I'd love to see more maps with this being beneficial to them, especially maybe in a multiplayer circuit. But the campaign for these guys is going to have a lot of those bogs. They can take advantage of it, right? If you have a unit slowly advancing through them, then even if your unit's not accurate, you've got all the time in the world to really kind of pluck off a lot of shots there. So that special rule plays in really well with these guys. So I figured it's now as a good time as any to talk about them before moving over to our next one, I believe is the Bloated Corpses. Now this one might be a little bit distracting. I mean, look at these fucking ramshackle sons of bitches. It's a unique model, and I like how ridiculous it is, so I'm keeping it for the conversation. Deal with it, guys. Oh my god. Okay, so let's read the lore on these guys. Some cadavers lurch from the sea, swollen with noxious gases, their liquefying tissues seeping from rotten and tattered skin. It is preferable by far to fight such a creature at a distance, for, when slain, their tortured forms disintegrate in a poisonous shower of decomposing internal organs and diseased fluids. So, I mean, the model just doesn't do it enough justice, but this is, again, a Warhammer 1 mod that's ported into 2, and I think their options were quite limited, but it's so good. So, these guys, really, the only way to explain them is that they're just meant to suicide. They're meant to get up close and explode, and when they do a ton of damage. Things that they actually hit can't take any saves against them, so they really, really mess things up. In the mod, he did a really good way of kind of, I guess you could say, equating that. But we don't really have anything that's quite like this in the game, right? Nothing that's like the little Zerg dudes that roll around and explode as soon as they hit you in StarCraft, or anything like that. That really just outright is like this, outside of maybe the Fanatics, which launch out of a unit. So these guys are going to explode outright. And in a game like Total War, that's very tricky. Here is, I think maybe another way to do this would be, rather than having them as an actual unit, there may be a summon. You know, they come up from the ground, especially on, I would hate to have it limited by a wet piece of terrain, because there's not many of that, or many of those. But what if these guys are summoned by Luthor Harkon? I know he doesn't have necromantic abilities, but the mod actually gives him summon crew to kind of still, because vampires need that, and there's no other vampires in the Vampire Coast army to summon, not even a necromancer. So this is their way of kind of getting around that, because it's a big part of the Total War version of vampires. So I get it, it makes sense. These guys, the way they work in tabletop, you know, it's easy to place things in cover so that they can't get shot and stuff like that. So it's easy to do that, and they're only 30 points. And in the tabletop, it's 1. The unit size of 1, so it's 30 points per bloated corpse. So you can place like a couple of these for You get 3 out for under 100 points, which is pretty great because they do a ton of damage if they ever connect. You can kind of have these guys ramshackle across the board. And again, in tabletop, it's easy to keep things in cover and they can't get hurt. In Total War, we're talking about a game that's got a gigantic map that it's easy to flank people in, it's easy to do hammer and anvil, stuff that you can't do in tabletop or is easy to pull off in tabletop you can't do in Total War. These guys are a really good example of, hey, really great in Total War, how are they going to be equated in Total War, or really great in tabletop, can they be equated in Total War? So I think they definitely have to be a voluminous unit like this. Like, good God, dude. As I zoom out, you can see just them in their horribleness. It's like they're at a party and all just lost and like on some form of weird molly where they can't stop like petting their knees, but at the same time, this music's on point. So the way he did this in the game, which I kind of dig. Let's take a look at these guys. There it is. Gaseous Demise. The unit will unleash a massive explosion when reduced to 20% health. So if they get low, they explode. I kind of like that. I think that's really nifty. Again, that's what you would expect. But rather than it waiting to get all the way down to 0, it's at 20. And they have 20 armor, so they can actually kind of make it into close combat a little bit better. Their melee defense is piss poor, but that's the point. You want that to be low. And it's got a really good poison right here. AP, speed, weapon damage, AP damage, and missile damage. So I really like this. I like that it does this. I wish it was a poison nova like blast that did cause poison and did damage. I think that's kind of a little more indicative. And I like that just their base melee attack is poisonous. So I think that the mod really nailed it on these guys as a really good way to bring them into the game while kind of keeping things true to form. Oh my God, that guy's face just fucking is going wild. Oh my God. Oh God. Oh, dude. Go get that looked at. Either way, I like how they did this in the game because I think that these guys are going to get targeted fast. But if they're so cheap, and if you can either summon them from Luthor Harkon or maybe even a Siren, or if you can get them in such a voluminous amount that you can just get them slowly trudging across the battlefield, it might actually work. I'm kind of like, I want to give these guys a vote for just being their own unit, because there's had to be so many mechanics around it, and I think they would just get focused down so quickly that they wouldn't be useful. So I'd be very interested to see how Creative Assembly brings these guys into the game. But the next unit we're going to talk about is going to be, I think, a pretty standard port over, but we'll talk about the Scurvy Dogs. And the Vampire Count army really needs stuff like this, in the tabletop especially, because they need stuff to either countercharge to get in the way, and we see the same thing in Total War Warhammer, right? We use our dire wolves, the vampire counts, to get in the back line to harass, do some damage here. So the Scurvy Dogs fit that niche the same way. Let's read the lore blurb on these guys. Many pirate settlements are filthy dives of scum and villainy, like Tatooine, infested with all manner of vermin and wild dogs, many of which are taken pity upon by drunken pirates and brought aboard ship as affectionate, if somewhat noisome pets. Many such dogs serve their masters beyond the death of both. These are less affectionate and a whole lot more noisome. So, again, this is a simple reskin for these guys, and I think even in a lot of ways, that's what these guys would have to be. It'd be cool if they were a little bit more characteristic. Like, picture if some of them had peg legs, if you put eye patches on them. Maybe that's a little too over the top, but I think it'd be kind of funny. I think it'd be kind of cool. The Vampire Coast is supposed to be a very whimsical and funny army. You're supposed to be thinking of like a meat grinder playing in the background the whole time, like an accordion going wild. Like, you're supposed to get that imagery in your head. It was released alongside a lot of really fun, colorful vampire articles. Oh, not articles, little blurbs on it saying like, hey, this is our motivation. We wanted this to be kind of an interesting comedic army. It requires a lot of conversion. So I want the Scurvy Dogs to be that kind of little extra over-the-top touch. Maybe they do have, like, again, really funny if they have little tiny pirate hats or something like that. I don't know. It'd just be fun. They don't have any crazy special rules. They're nothing over-the-top. There's typical movement 9 and tabletops. These guys should be your little skirmisher cav, basically. It's just your dire wolves and vampire counts. There's not much to go off of with these guys. Again, they're not supposed to be over-the-top and crazy. I mean, you can take a look at the rules for them, and it's, again, very, very, very generic. I think the difference is these have less HP than direwolves. I think direwolves have like 6,300 at full strength. So take all that, of course, with a grain of salt. It's a mod. It's not canon. So again, just another reskin of direwolves in some way, shape, or form, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with Scurvy Dogs not being some crazy unique unit. Maybe give them poison attacks if you really want to go the whole 9 yards. I could be okay with that. It kind of makes a little bit of a sense, but outside of that, I don't think they need to have any crazy attributes attached to them. I think that it's okay with them just being a kind of a different reskin version of direwolves. Speaking of reskins, though, it's important to talk about our next two, kind of in the same breath: the Razortooth Rats and the Deck Droppers. So the Razortooth Rats, let's read the lore blurb first on this. Most rats abandon a sinking ship, but the lean rodents that scuttle about the bilges of Harkin's fleet are more than content to forsake their vessel even before it is foundered, driven by an undying hunger for the flesh of the living. So, again, this would just simply be a rat swarm. I'm focusing on the bats because they're going to be more pertinent for the next entry. This would be just a simple rat swarm. We don't see swarms in the game outside of the tomb swarms from Tomb Kings, so I guess fell bats are kind of, there used to be a swarm unit. So I'm not sure if Razortooth Rats would even make it into the game. I think they would have to, if they did, maybe that's going to be an FLC that's just tack on for the Skaven at the same time, because they would essentially be the same thing. They would just be pestilent undead rats. There's nothing kind of crazy about these guys. In fact, they're just little skirmisher dudes that kind of scuttle out and attack things. And I think that might be why swarms might not be in the game, is because there's so many other things that kind of fit the niche of a swarm that having them in Total War Warhammer, I think, might just cause unit bloat. And they're like, well, if 5 other things do the same thing that this one does, but at like a marginal cost increase with better stats, why even bother? So I think that's why they're not in it. But we'll move over now to the Deck Droppers, which are pretty cool. So let's read the lore blurb here. The bats hang from the topmost spars, high in the rigging of Harkin's pirate fleet, dormant until the coppery tang of blood fills the air. When battle rages, they dive among the combatants, each bearing a vicious, though somewhat disoriented, zombie pirate in their sharp talons. So really cool. And if you don't understand what I'm talking about here, these are bats that are carrying units. So that they have a large unit size, and they drop zombie pirates. So that'd be really damn cool. So they swoop down and they attack. Zombies attack for them. So basically this would be a unit of fell bats, like we see here, that would be carrying the deckhands that we have already taken a look at. They would have the same exact profile too, with the 3 weapon skill, the 3 strength, 3 toughness, with 2 wounds though. So they'd be a little bit more adept. They have 3 attacks. So these guys are basically a flying unit of deckhands. Just think of it that way. It's the best way. So these guys can actually do a little bit more damage, not considerable. Just think of a flying unit of swordsmen, which is a really funny image if you just think of it without wings. Flying unit of swordsmen, Empire swordsmen that can get in that back line and do a crap ton of damage. Like, I mean, if the Deck Droppers, you take them, let's just say 4 probably costs, let's just say 500 or 300. You could get 4 units of those, fly them across, drop them in the back line, have them attack range, and that's a pretty good pin down. That's a pretty good way to get a slow moving unit into the back line too. And this is almost like kind of like an air cavalry for them. It's their fastest attack, heaviest hitting unit in the game. Outside of we'll talk about it soon, but in their roster. So I think it's a really cool and different way. And I'm sorry if the bats are giving you motion sickness. I'm watching them as I'm talking about this, and I'm like, I'm gonna throw the fuck up. But I really like the Deck Droppers. I think they're really cool. And maybe if they didn't even carry the guys, the deckhands, and attack with them, maybe if they just drop them, almost like you can see with any of the pterodactyls, how they actually drop payloads of damage, or the phoenixes, or the gyro bombers, anything like that. So maybe they just actually drop a unit, which would be pretty cool too in and of itself. So then you've got just a unit of fell bats after that do the damage that they need to do. But the Deck Droppers are very unique, very different, and I really, really enjoy them because they're really cool too. Like, there's some conversion models down, and we'll flash those up here, but I really enjoy the way that these guys kind of work from a mechanic standpoint and just from an aesthetic standpoint. I think they're really just over the top and cool, and again, in a lot of the ways that I think Vampire Coast armies are supposed to be, especially considering they've got gunpowder. And what's more prolific than handgunners is cannons. So again, this is one of the huge things for the Vampire Coast. They have what's called a carronade. Many of the ships in the Vampire fleet carry small-bore, short-barreled cannons, known as carronades or smashers. Though their power pales by comparison to that of an Imperial Great Cannon, it can still wipe out whole files of foemen in a single shot. So obviously we have access to a short-range cannon, one that's it's supposed to be one of the smaller ones that's on the back of a deck. It's a smaller cannon that can be positioned around a little bit quicker by less crewmen. And there's no real difference in this in Total War in the actual tabletop. In tabletop, it's just simply a cannon. It's not the Empire Great Cannon, which has some different special rules. But for all intents and purposes, it's just a fucking cannon. So, what does this mean, though? Well, it means that this zombie crew is, as you would have guessed it, a zombie crew. So you've got cheaper cannons, you can field more of them. And the interpretation in the mod is just that. Rather than this being 1 unit of 3, you have 1 unit that consists of 6. So you're doubling the amount of cannons for, I can't remember the cost on the mod, but that doesn't really matter at this point because it's super conjecture and not really worth discussing. But that's how I would assume this would be, is same cost or lower cost even than an Empire Great Cannon with more cannons, because again, these zombies have 0 ballistic skill. So if they roll a die and they hit on a 6, it backfires on a 1. So how does that work here for the cannons? It's going to have to be a little bit different, but I expect it to be, again, whimsical and goofy. And the cool thing about Vampire Coast, I keep wanting to say counts, is that it is very similar to the lovely backdrop. Look at those trees. It is very similar to the Vampire counts, but with the addition of all this black powder, you have all the benefits of, say, an Empire army without the biggest weakness, their leadership. Of course, crumbling is going to be an issue with any low leadership army like the zombies and skeletons of the Vampire counts, but Vampire Coast probably going to be a little bit more, you could say, zombie friendly. These zombies are going to be a little bit better than your typical VC zombies. So hopefully that translates to some fun mechanics here. But I would really love to just see a battery of cannons unloading down the line at, say, a unit of Skaven, but then watching some of them just explode because they backfire. I don't know why that sounds so great, because it sounds terrible if you're actually playing them. You're just like, no, my army, my cannons. But I think it'd be a lot of fucking fun, especially because look at this one dude. Look at this one guy. Massive cod piece. Look at that undead beard. That guy's got no nose. He knows what's up. Black on black, very slimming, sir. Very slimming. So he's ready to go to the vampire ball. But I'm really excited to see how they might translate the carronade. On top of that, though, the carronade being one of them, of course, but how they're going to translate the animated hulks. And these guys are a little bit different here than just, say, a crypt horror. They've used the troll skin for them in this mod, and I think it's kind of cool, kind of fitting, but let's read this little thing here. Not all mariners are of human stature and girth. Indeed, many ogres take passage aboard ocean-going vessels in search of money or food. Thusly, not all of Harkin's eternal indenturees are of similar size to a man, though for some reason the reanimation process often yields more unpredictable results. So I like that they've used trolls in this, but you could have a unit that is ramshackled, right? It could just be crypt horrors and ghouls and ogres, all sorts of stuff. But it's just a hodgepodge of just kind of bloated, undead, maybe oversized pirate hats on these dudes. But these guys, again, would be your monstrous infantry for the Vampire Coast. They would be able to kind of get up there in personal, jump through the rest of your zombie line, and help smash up the enemy. In the same way that people kind of use crypt horrors now, they always kind of accent Death Guard with them. Let's look out. The mod interprets them with AP, just like we get for the crypt horrors. We get that ability to really kind of smash apart armor. So I think that these guys are going to be somewhat like the actual reskin version of crypt horrors, because again, they're not supposed to be overly unique. They don't have any special rules. They just have hand weapons. So there's nothing about these guys that, just like the scurvy dogs, that really stands out. But I think it's just Games Workshop and, well, again, extension Creative Assembly when that happens, or if it happens, ability to kind of say, hey, how would these guys be translated into the game? Well, they're going to need some form of way to hold the line, and maybe animated hulks kind of gives that ability. So I think Games Workshop looked at it as, okay, this army needs a little bit more staying power, a little bit more centralized power, and the animated hulks gives them that, because they have higher toughness, very high strength, a lot of wounds, a lot of attacks. So again, it gives them that ability to be a little unpredictable because their attacks are on a D6 basis rather than a set basis. So I don't know how they translate that very well, but again, that's up to Creative Assembly if they decide to put these guys in the game. But I enjoy the notion of having a monstrous unit in this army, and I'm on board with it. You know, even if they look like this little handsome guy. Look at him. Imagine sitting across the table from him. Could you stop drooling in your pudding, please? It's not drool. I'm spitting. Okay. You've had a rough day. We'll talk about it later. Anyway, moving on. Now coming up to I think it's our last 2 units really here. The deck gunners here. And these guys are pretty cool. You can see they have a little bit different weaponry. They're not the typical handgun that you would typically see. They have what's called a swivel gun. Let's read their little lore blurb. Dead or alive, all pirates love guns, and the bigger they are, the better. Though the barrels are corroded and the aim of the gunners be poor, arr, the sheer power and range of Harkin's swivel gunners commands respect from his foes. So kind of almost like an aquabus. They're meant to do a good amount of damage in a relatively short range, 36 inches, which is not that short actually, to be really honest. But in the tabletop, they have what's called a cavalry base. So you could almost look at these guys as Warplock Jezzails, but dead. So Warplock Jezzails from the Skaven army. And I love to see these guys kind of doing a lot of AP damage, maybe in the same way as an organ gun, but a little bit more mobile because, well, they're a roving zombie unit. And these guys actually can hold their own in combat too, so that's kind of awesome because they have a hand weapon, they have the swivel gun, they even have a 6-up armor save, so that's pretty uncharacteristic for the army. So these guys are a little bit more, I don't want to say elite, but they since there are more per base, they have a little bit better of a stat profile. That kind of like lends to it. But in the tabletop, they're only worth 10 points a unit, so they're pretty inexpensive to get going, and I kind of like that. Let's take a look at how the mod does them, which is just your typical AP damage, a range of 225, which is pretty significant, very significant actually, and but not a lot of ammo. All of the mod gives them all poor accuracy and slow rate of fire, so it's kind of fun. I think it's kind of a cool way of doing it. So because they have all this good range, and they have pretty significant AP damage from these guys, since they're roving. I like the way they kind of break that up. I think, oh well, they really can't hit shit. So I like that at least. But again, these guys are going to be cool because they're going to have those aquabuses. They're going to be just roving through the sides or maybe even the back line, because I think that the vampire counts are not going to care about Vampire Coast. Is not going to care about its units, so they'll just shoot into them willy-nilly because they're so expendable. I think that'll be a big part of this too, is just ripping through your own units as your units explode from using their own weaponry and also firing down range. Like, I think it's a lot of death is going to happen from these guys. They're going to be very chaotic and very hard to control and maintain. Speaking of being chaotic and hard to maintain, what says that more than a rotting Leviathan? Comes complete without wings. This is an old mod from Total War Warhammer 1 that someone ported into 2, so his only option was a zombie dragon. A zombie dragon, so makes sense. It works. It plays. He didn't have obviously have access to Charybdis or Hydra at the time that he could have done some cool stuff with, but again, it plays. Took the wings off. Looks a little bit nicer. Looks a bit homier. He clips his wings like a lovebird. Be that as it may. So these guys, let's read their lore blurb here. There are many great and wondrous creatures in the seas of the old world, from the sea dragons and kraken of the great ocean to the crab-like Prometheans of the Lustrian coastline. The sea's bounty is truly as varied as land-going life. Not that Harkin cares much about this either way. He just waits until they're dead and infinitely more controllable. So again, the Rotting Leviathan could be anything. I mean, I think that's the point of the Vampire Coast army, is to make everything very innocuous and nondescript so that you can just, oh, well, I've designed it this way, thus that's what it is. Versus, okay, these Tomb Guard, here's a description for them. And again, still a pretty innocuous description, so you can make them however you want. But again, I think this is, hey, kit bash whatever you want to make this thing and call it a Rotting Leviathan. And in tabletop, they're pretty much the same thing as a dragon without wings. They don't have a very significantly high weapon skill, but they have a very high strength and toughness, a lot of wounds, a lot of attacks. But I think that we would just see this as basically a zombie dragon on land. It doesn't have any breath attacks, so that's a big thing. It does have slimy skin, meaning that anytime you're attacking it, you have a -1 to hit. So maybe he has an aura around him that reduces melee attack damage, with melee attack and or damage to represent that skin, or maybe just anytime you're attacking him, it's a buff that gets slapped on you. I think adding Noxious Breath would be kind of cool to these guys, or at least some sort of variation of it. Maybe they come in different shapes and sizes. Maybe you can choose different variations of them, because, you know, it talks about Krakens, Sea Dragons, and Prometheans. So maybe you've got some different variation of the Rotting Leviathan that's maybe focused. You know, maybe you've got the Promethean with its pincers is better at cracking open armor, or the Sea Dragon might be better at eating droves of infantry because of a larger mouth, something of the sort. Kraken on land, let's just not be crazy here, guys. I've already discussed wolves and undead dogs with peg legs. Why would a Kraken be on the land? You're right. It's because he's on a floating palantir from the lizard men, and he has a really ridiculously small little tiny pirate hat on top of his Kraken head. Fucking, I've made it. Creative Assembly, if you're listening, I don't know if you guys are doing this or not, but I think if anything, that's how you should do the Kraken on land. God, genius. Okay, let's just take a look at how the mod says these guys work, right? So slimy skin. Oh yeah, cool. So it does a hex in the area, -10 melee attack. So makes sense. Everything else though, even their melee attack is very large in the mod's representation. 70 is pretty huge with 515 weapon strength. Them being undead without a caster, or I'm sorry, a lord on top of them, I would think their melee attack would be a little bit lower, but I guess so as to not gimp them outright, they kind of probably matched up with some of the other beasts, terrestrial-based beasts. But let's talk about the last entry here. We'll just keep the Rotting Leviathan up while we talk about it. There's no model, there's no art, there's nothing cool for the Queen Bess. This enormous and oft-repaired monstrosity is Harkin's pride and joy. The exact heritage of the Queen Bess is uncertain, but from the reports that have reached the colleges of Nuln, it is likely to have begun life as nothing less than a Hellhammer cannon. It has since been much refined and improved by Harkin in one of his more than unusually lucid moments, not to mention reduced in size somewhat. Even so, the Queen Bess remains one of the most powerful pieces of black powder artillery ever to grace the shores of Lustria. So, I kind of look at this as abilities that we see with the Dark Elves, right? The Dark Elves, if they have their Black Ark Corsairs, if they have the Black Arcs within range, they can use special abilities. I think the Queen Bess would be on a ship that would give an ability like this, or maybe if it's within the range of, say, a building, it can do that. I'm not sure. Maybe Queen Bess is always an ability as attached to Luthor Harkon that allows him to just basically drop artillery on the map wherever he wants on a certain cooldown. And that would be the big thing too, is that it'll kind of help even the odds against the vampire counts for the Vampire Coast, is having them have this ability that allows them to just drop a huge amount of ordnance at random times. Because I think it kind of needs that little touch, that little oomph, because you're going to need to get up, you're going to have to pull a lot of tricks up your sleeve with the Vampire Coast. You have a really weird ramshackle infantry, you have a lot of weird black powder you have access to, which is very unreliable. So maybe this is the only reliable thing in the army. But as a whole, I think the Vampire Coast is going to be a very fun army, and I'm really excited for a possibility of how CA would approach this. Creative Assembly has done a lot of really cool approaches to the Tomb Kings, or a lot of really cool approaches to how they've done martial prowess and murderous prowess, and I love the way that they kind of take what is lore and still make it flavorful. I've said like 15 million goddamn times. But I still think by and large, we're possibly in for a treat with whatever this army, this campaign pack proves to be. It does have to be something custom. It does have to be something that's a little out of the box. And even though we've covered stuff from Vampire Coast here, it cannot be all that the roster is comprised of. There has to be more things. And there's stuff that Creative Assembly has to dig deep in the lore to find. Or if they were to do stuff with the Amazons, it would have to be deep within the lore for them to go into. Estalia and Tilia have some pretty good fleshed out lists in the Dogs of War books, so they're very, very strong candidates. You know, we even see that Millie Margarita, in Tilia, or Estalia, I can't remember which one on the top of my head right now, but Margarita has 10 production slots. So it's very possible they're saving this for a DLC. Is this the campaign pack coming up? I don't know. Is it Vampire Coast? I don't know. Or Coast? I don't know. But I think that as we explore some more of these options, we're going to see what's going to make the most sense in not just the Vortex campaign, but what what empires will look like for a whole, as well as the future of Total War, Warhammer 1, 2, and 3. But as always, guys, thanks for watching here today. Hopefully you enjoyed this little foray down the lovely lane in which is the Vampire Coast. If you have any questions or any kind of comments on this, go ahead and let me know. If you hear a cat in the background, it's because I have a cat. My roommate does, and it just can't stop meowing, so I apologize if that popped up in the recording every so often. But again, if you guys have any questions, do let me know. If you have any suggestions of how you want these guys to run, or if there's any units I miss from other of the Citadel journals, which are really old publications, go ahead and let me know. I'd love to just cover those in another video, or at least just talk about it with you in the comments. But as always, guys, thanks for watching. Have a good one, and take care.